If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to Downfall Network for more cool content.
What's up, everyone? Thralls of Metal, Shredlord here, back again to do a Wielder spotlight on another great metal guitar player. This week I've decided to dive into the legendary thrash guitarist Gary Holt. Gary Holt is one of the godfathers of thrash guitar. He's a super underrated riff master and slayer of solos. He is definitely an inspiration to thrash guitar players everywhere, or at least he definitely should be. The thing that makes Gary Holt special is his ability to write crushing, fast, thrashy, break-your-neck kind of riffs, and still have the finesse to play incredibly technical, fast, precise, yet still very melodic guitar solos. So, Gary is a normal California type kid, growing up in California. About 16, 17 years old, he starts getting into the early Bay Area thrash scene, which I believe if you've watched our previous video with Necrotic and I doing the Murder in the Front Row documentary, which is the whole Bay Area thrash documentary about how it all started, you'll know that Gary Holt became friends with, I believe at the time it was a three-piece band called Exodus, and became very good friends with the then Exodus guitar player. You know him, some of you love him, some of you hate him, Kirk Hammett. So when Gary meets Exodus, he fast becomes friends with Kirk Hammett, the guitar player at the time, and they start to hang out frequently, and Kirk actually says, "Hey man, why don't you grab a guitar? I'll show you a couple chords." And I believe in a past interview I've watched with Gary, he says he doesn't quite remember what the song was that Kirk showed him, but he's 99.9% sure that it was a Rolling Stones song. So Kirk decides to show Gary first set of chords, some Rolling Stones or something to pique his interest. Gary takes those chords and starts grinding and grinding and grinding his ass off on the guitar. And literally 6 months, probably around 6 months later, from being shown his first chords, Gary was then being introduced as a replacement guitarist in Exodus to stand alongside next to Kirk. And literally a year later in 1983, they ended up releasing their very first EP. It is the only Exodus release that has Kirk Hammett on it. So after the release of their EP, about a year goes by, and guitar player of Exodus at the time, Kirk Hammett, decides that he is going to leave Exodus to become the other guitar player in a very small, not well-known band at all called Metallica, who was hitting it big at the time and doing European festivals and tours and everything. So he goes and joins those guys after the whole Dave Mustaine thing. We won't talk about that. Still a touchy subject to me. So Kirk and Gary still being friends, no animosity, you know. What's cool about that whole scene, the Bay Area thrash scene, is how they were all friends. So I believe they were all really encouraging because they wanted their own to make it, you know. Even if Kirk didn't have that success with Exodus, Gary still wanted to see him pursue it with Metallica. And Metallica, of course, did great things all around the world, sold millions and millions of albums, so on and so forth. So it was cool that those guys stayed friends, and it was basically like Kirk saying, "Here, man, Exodus was my band since the beginning pretty much, but now I'm handing you the keys to the car, and I want you to go ahead and run with this. So here Gary is, a young guitar player, just given the keys to the Lamborghini or whatever, however the hell you want to say it, basically just giving this band and saying, here man, this is your band, let's see what you can do with it. He takes his influences of UFO and Rainbow and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and Motorhead, things like that, and he starts melding them together and starts writing what ends up becoming one of the greatest, probably arguably the greatest thrash metal album ever released. So that album, of course, is 1985's Bonded by Blood. And the cool, interesting fact about that album, I guess I don't know if it's cool per se, but they had actually written it much earlier than they released it due to business setbacks, as they called it, creative differences, and some lineup changes and stuff like that. It didn't get released actually until 1985, but when it finally did release, it, like I said before, it's arguably one of the greatest thrash metal albums of all time, and it definitely cemented Exodus's status to be able to belong with, at the times, the Slayers and the Anthraxes and the Megadeths and the Metallicas.
You tempted, yes, all top there. Shove it up your ass where the sun ain't shining. We know now what it takes to defend. If disaster strikes, then they'll be hiding. Corruption! 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 Corruption!
So Gary spent a good majority of his career doing Exodus and only Exodus, as rightfully so it is his baby. So for that reason, I'm going to just kind of explain Exodus a little bit, because I feel like by doing that, I'm explaining Gary a little bit better, part of Gary's story for sure. And also, he is the only member of Exodus to be on every single album. He's their main songwriter and contributor, so I guess like a quarterback in football, right? I'm wearing my football shit. You know, sometimes if you're the quarterback, if it's good, they blame you. If it's bad, they blame you. But Gary has been DTF for Exodus the entire time. So that, and the fact that there really isn't too much information about Gary out there. He's a very private person. He doesn't do, honestly, up until he joined Slayer, I didn't really see him do a lot of press, if any. The only thing I was familiar with that he had out that was anything remotely YouTube-ish or any interview type stuff like that was he had a guitar instructional video out called A Lesson in Guitar Violence that he released in 2008.
Are we rolling?
Yeah.
It's okay to deviate. God damn it, I totally almost had it. I'm gonna have to stab someone with my sword. All right. I cannot stress the importance of rhythm playing enough. This is Gary Holt from Exodus, and welcome to Thrash Metal Boot Camp. Now drop it, give me 20, Private!
So up until Slayer stuff, he really didn't do much. So there isn't really a lot of content, there isn't really a lot of information, random things like, oh, Gary's a vegan, and oh, Gary is, very political minded, or oh, Gary enjoys kickball with his dog. Like, that's all cool, well and good, but it doesn't really add much content here. So for that reason, let me give you a brief rundown on who Exodus is. Now, some could say that Exodus would be considered number 5 in the Big Four if the Big Four added one more band to the list. Being from the exact same area, being friends with all the guys basically who are in the Big Four, they are very underrated and very important to that whole scene and that movement, even if they didn't get as much radio airplay as some of the other bands. Altogether, as a collective unit, they have 10 studio albums, and most of them are pretty fucking killer. Every band has a stinker here or there along the way, but if you just want some kick-ass thrash metal, Exodus is a place that you can never go wrong. So back to Gary. Now that I've kind of explained a little bit of Exodus for you, but that's pretty much what Gary was doing the entire time, so there's not too much to report, but he ends up in 2011, another famous guitar player from a metal band, Jeff Hanneman, decides that I got bit in the hand by a spider, and he also was having some cirrhosis issues because I don't know if you know this or not, but Slayer likes to drink. I know, it's a shock to some of you, but it's true. They're alcoholics.
Disco is dead. Yay! Woo!
Play our fucking hearts out.
Dude, we got a beer break here.
Beer break.
This beer sucks, but it's free, so we can't complain.
Tom Araya was not very open to having somebody come in and Slayer continue to tour and do things until Jeff got better. He was actually wanting to wait for Jeff to heal up and get back on the road with them. But I think Carrie kind of had the desire, and Carrie is a big, powerful voice in Slayer, so I think he was kind of feeling around who wanted to do it, and then finally somebody tossed Gary Holt's name around the table, and I remember watching an interview with Tom Araya where he basically says, oh, Gary, like, he was very opposed to it, but when he heard Gary, there was a comfort level there because they were all very personally close. They were all friends with each other. He knew what kind of a good guy Gary was. He knew what kind of an outstanding guitar player Gary was. And I think the most important thing to Slayer is if they did bring somebody in, they would want it to be somebody who the fans respect. And I think Gary Holt, as the guitar player and lead creative force in one of the biggest thrash metal bands, definitely fits that bill. So he was asked to come in, and he of course said, yeah, sure, why not? And ended up filling in on tour. Now eventually we all know the story. Jeff Hanneman unfortunately passes away. So we bury him, rip. And Gary decides to step in full time. Gary ended up making one studio album with Slayer due to their retirement in 2019. That Slayer album, of course, is Repentless. Now, I think that Kerry King was okay with allowing some leads. He seemed very intent on not disrespecting the fans, which I actually appreciate out of Kerry King. Watching interviews about this and what their approach, Slayer's approach, was to Gary Holt's allowance, or what, the reins as far as what they would want him to do on this album, because Gary could go in there and do anything. I mean it when I say he is an excellent riff writer and an amazing lead player. Like, there's nothing he can't do. So if they asked him to write songs, if they asked him to contribute riffs, he would absolutely be able to do so, and they would be kick-ass. But I think Gary really wanted to respect the fans, and a majority of the material was already written before Gary was asked to become a permanent member anyway, so they just decided to keep the writing all in-house and ask Gary to do the leads. However, if you listen to that album, although it's not one of my all-time favorite Slayer albums, there is a lot to like on it, and there are some excellent lead guitar playing on Slayer. The cool thing about Gary and Slayer to me was everyone knows that Jeff Hanneman and Kerry King are not the most technically precise guitar players. They're good, but they're not the most technically precise. Gary Holt can do it all. So from a technique standpoint, it was really interesting and really nice to hear a guitar player who was able to execute it a little bit cleaner, but also never lose the vibe. And I think that was the most important thing about Gary with Slayer, is he never loses the vibe with his solos. I mean, because sometimes you get a guitar player. A guitar is a very individual instrument, right? A lot of people have their own style, have their own sounds. So if you get somebody famous filling in for somebody else who's famous, a lot of times you get this famous guy going, well, I'm not going to do it the way this person did, right? Like Kiko in Megadeth. He says, I love Marty Friedman, but I'm not going to play everything Marty Friedman played just like that. And that's a totally acceptable thing. But in this instance, I feel like Gary was able to play everything and then some, but never lose the vibe of the song. He never took anything away from it, and he stayed authentic the whole time, and that's what made Gary work so easy with Slayer. He knew what he was there for, and he did the best he could, and he knocked it out of the park, man. Not many guitar players can walk into Slayer and hold their own, and he can, man, because that's a hard gig. The fans have a certain expectation, and you need to fit that bill and be good, and he walked in and did a great job. So I think the fans were very pleased with him as a replacement until the retirement in 2019. So basically, even though not a lot is known about Gary, we do know a lot about Exodus, and we can use our ears to listen to that beautiful Exodus. Once again, I'll throw you 5 songs of Gary's that I think are great, and then I'll throw you 5 solos of Gary's that I think are great. And it would also probably be a good thing for some of these people who are not familiar with Exodus, or some of these guitar players who may be familiar with Exodus but not really familiar with Gary Holt. Check him out. There's definitely a lot to like about this guy's playing, so I highly encourage it. Check out the list and tell me what you guys think. Make up your own lists too. I like reading different people's lists, especially when it's, favorite solos, favorite songs, favorite riffs, so on and so forth. And also too, for you aspiring thrash guitar players, don't forget, in 2008, I mentioned earlier, he did release a guitar video called A Lesson in Guitar Violence. Obviously a ploy on an Exodus, A Lesson in Violence, but it is pretty funny. The lesson is good, but the thing that catches me off guard is the fact that it's a green screen in the back, and there is some cheesy ass green screen shit going on. So another great way to kind of visually see what kind of a great guitar player Gary is, go check out just the intro of that video. He kind of puts everything on display as most, guitar players do in an instructional video. You have the lead in and they're just playing that piece like, yeah, I'm gonna fucking show you everything I got. But I digress. The reason I love Gary so much, before I wrap this up, is the fact that he seems like, A, such a chill guy, B, everybody loves him. Nobody has a bad word to say about him. Every time he opens his mouth and speaks, I somehow like him even more. He just seems like a really solid dude, and you can really get behind a really solid dude who's super talented the way Gary is. And for me, even not being the biggest Kirk Hammett fan when it comes to his lead guitar playing, I feel like Gary kind of took the style of Kirk Hammett and practiced way more and just mastered it way more, because he's a perfect thrash lead guitar player, but he executes it with the precision and the technique so that way it doesn't sound sloppy. It's perfect, it's melodic. Mwah. All right, my little cretins, it's about that time. So Shredlord here at Thralls of Metal, getting ready to sign off. But remember, folks, if you liked what you saw here, please hit the like, the subscribe, and dingy my bell, so that way you get notified of all the great Thralls of Metal content that get released on the daily. Last but not least, if you guys would be so kind enough, to the 2 or 3 people that watch this, would you be so kind enough as to drop down your guitar players' names that maybe you would like to see me do kind of a recap on in a later video? I would be curious to know what you guys want. I would also be curious to stumble upon guitar players maybe that I haven't dove into as much. I think one of the cool things about being a musician and a guitar player is that constant trying to discover new people, new feeling, you know, that new feeling of excitement, new feeling of inspiration. So I'm always looking out there. So all you guitar players that play, if you guys have a favorite guitar player you want me to do a recap on or check out, please drop a comment below, because I'd love to see what you guys have to offer. So Shredlord out. Have a good evening.